Dear committee members, colleagues, friends, family, I will now present briefly some of the research I've been conducting in the last 5 years that resulted in my manuscript, Geography of Happiness, a comparative exploration of the case of France. Happiness, a subject of philosophical debate for millennia, a political object for centuries, a scientific topic that entered the laboratory for decades. What have we learned since we work on happiness from a scientific perspective? Why should we, as social scientists, bother studying happiness at all? Well, there is now a decent body of literature that suggests that happiness is worthwhile considering from a few perspectives. There are in this committee sociologists, psychologists, and economists. Well, in all of these fields, we now have some evidence that happiness is an interesting object to look at, an interesting lens to watch the world. Sociology, we know that happiness of individuals influences the way people socialize. Some studies point out that traditional married women are happier than their non-traditional counterparts. Studies of couples with young children generally find a negative effect of children on marital happiness. Psychology, we know that happy people have less mental disorders. We know that introverts and neurotic report less happy. We even know that happy people live longer. Economy, we know that a good work-life balance positively influences the happiness of employees. We know that happy people are more productive. We know that unemployment has lasting impact on happiness, a phenomenon known as the scarring effect. Those are brief examples that show that happiness has implication in all the different disciplines I previously mentioned. Before going any further, let me describe what I mean here by happiness. In the rest of this talk, and in most of the dissertation, unless otherwise stated, I refer to happiness in the sense of life satisfaction. This implies a subjective appreciation of one's life. In order to measure it, respondents are asked to evaluate how satisfied they are with the life they lead on a scale from 0 or 1 to 10. This definition and the corresponding measurement present several advantages. It is a clear concept, it is easily measured, and it prevents from any pre-established normative assumptions of what is good for the respondents. Researchers in the field of happiness studies have all heard of this so-called Easterlin paradox. The situation described by the economist Easterlin is called a paradox, insofar as it presents an apparent contradiction. In the United States, between the years 1946 and 1970, whereas the average GDP per capita rose steadily, the average happiness stayed about the same. This was counterintuitive for orthodox economists, for whom wealth was implicitly or explicitly conducive to welfare. Some call it the Easterlin paradox. Some, including in this committee, propose another interpretation. Some even call it the Easterlin illusion. There are certain disagreements and ongoing debates on this paradox, but there is a general agreement that at a national level, average happiness is higher in richer countries than in less rich countries. This is very easily shown. When plotting a graph with happiness and wealth, or here purchasing power, it is possible to plot a trend illustrated here by the plain line. When looking at such a graph, there are two ways to look at it, and both are correct, insufficient, and complementary. We can observe a certain consistency, meaning that the line drawn on this graph represents fairly well the relationship between happiness and wealth. It is also possible to look at it from the other side. The regression is far from representing well all nations. As a matter of fact, one can even find entire geocultural groups for which this average relationship between wealth and happiness does not work at all. Some fall far from it. Two extreme examples are Latin America, where every single nation is above the line, and former communist nations, for which every nation is below the line. If we take a closer look, this observation is also valid within certain happiness groups. Let me take a closer look at the group of rich nations, which I characterize here as the nations included in the rectangle. This is the part of the graph where an increase in wealth does not seem to mean an increase in happiness. As you can see, in a group of countries that is fairly homogeneous in terms of societal development, the differences are important, with more than 2 points between Hong Kong and Denmark, for instance. This might not seem much on a 0 to 10 scale. However, if you look at the average of the nations, they are all included in a 3 to 8 scale, so a 5-point range. So 2 points is important. In this group of rich nations, some nations are well below the line in every survey. I can cite here, for instance, Japan, Germany, Italy, or France. As the latter is the country where I was born, the one that I know the most, one typically associated with high quality of life, I decided to take it as a starting point around which I did my research, even if I took some freedom to explore other parts of the world, and in particular in part 1. I use starting point on purpose, as the goal is already dual. 1, understanding possible determinants of the relative unhappiness in France, and 2, as I used largely comparisons, derived mechanisms that may apply beyond the case of France. This slide briefly highlights the outline of the dissertation that is divided into 2 main parts. As my time is limited, let me skip part 1 and jump directly to part 2, which is the main part of the dissertation. What could then explain the relative happiness or unhappiness in France? A few authors have worked on the question, mostly economists based in France, among whom Claudia Senik, best present in this committee. Trust in institutions, lack of reciprocity, schooling have been proposed as part, among others, of the interpretative framework. My interpretation is partly in line with these arguments and comes in addition to them. My initial goal was to find elements in the objective world to explain the relatively low level of subjective well-being, happiness in France. After a literature review and some data mining, I felt I had at the same time a lot of information and quite some noise. I was not satisfied with the elements I could derive from the data. And the literature seemed incomplete to provide a solid basis to work on the question. Some studies were different, sometimes contradictory, and I didn't get a feeling of how I would tackle, at least partially, my initial question. There is a proverb among mathematicians that says, a good mathematician is a lazy one, because he or she goes the quickest to the solution. I don't know if this proverb applies in social sciences. What I do know is that you can find a way through which you lose a lot of noise without losing too much information. It is probably the sound move to make. I had the impression to make such a move when I decided to explore closer freedom. The field was somewhat more uniform, the studies more in line, and I was more comfortable getting a feeling of the data. It is an interesting construct that has as quality of life an objective and a subjective part. For convenience matters, I talk about freedom in the singular, but it does not mean that freedom is unidimensional, an off-the-shelf concept. Freedom is plural, multidimensional, complex. Freedom exists in various forms: positive or negative freedom, objective or subjective freedom, individual or collective freedom. It is quite easy to derive a sense of objective freedom from the objective conditions of a society, AD. We know very well from the literature the link between subjective freedom and happiness, CD. Thus, if we can find a link between objective freedom and subjective freedom, we will have a ground to work on. In a way, what I do here is using, in a metaphorical way, the good old shallow vector relation that said that AD equals AB plus BC plus CD. And I must add that this transformation only makes sense because the concepts are closely related. If they weren't, if the relations were loose, you would lose too much signal, and this model wouldn't make sense. So what I did in part 2 is to explore freedom in various forms. I looked into feeling of freedom, freedom at school, freedom at work, freedom in families. Feeling of freedom and locus of control refers to the ability of individual to feel they're in control of their own lives. It has been proved to be the highest predictor of happiness across nations. This factor appears low in France in comparison with other developed nations. Fine, but that indicator is subjective, just as happiness, so it does not give us so much extra information. Indeed, correlating a subjective factor with another subjective factor, especially using the same scale, is like measuring the height of the waves on a floating boat. The boat moves together with the waves, so you're not too sure what you're exactly measuring. What I did in chapter 4, which I consider as the cornerstone of my dissertation, is to anchor this feeling of freedom in the objective world. So, the initial question, why do French people report less happy, becomes, can we find elements in objective freedom to explain a subjective feeling of unfreedom? To do so, I used the ternary classification of Bay, who characterized 3 types of freedom: social freedom, psychological freedom, and potential freedom. Social freedom refers to the absence of restrictions in the society. Civil liberties, no restrictions to trade, possibilities to pursue individual preferences. Potential freedom refers to the awareness of given opportunities in a society. Psychological freedom depicts the lack of inner mental barriers. A metaphor to explain this concept of freedom is the metaphor of the prison. If the door is shut, that is social and freedom. The door might be open, but I might be unaware of it. That is potential and freedom. It might as well be open, but I wouldn't dare going out. That's psychological and freedom. Comparing France and Finland was illustrative in that perspective. The purchasing power per capita is the same, but the difference of happiness is more than 1 point. The difference in perceived freedom is even higher. Is that a matter of social, psychological, or potential freedom? In chapter 4, I propose an operarization of the 3 independent types of freedom. The result was the following. Social freedom was somewhat higher in Finland, potential freedom was about the same, but the large difference was in psychological freedom. Let me finish with some wise words from Erich Fromm, who wrote a lot about freedom, first in his original language. Die Fähigkeit zu sublimieren ist freilich unbegaben, die bei den Menschen nur selten vorkommt. Das Scheitern der Sublimierung führt aber zu Neurose. If the amount of suppression is greater than the capacity for sublimations, individuals become neurotic, and it is necessary to allow the lessening of suppression. That was a very brief exploration of the topic I've been working on. I'm now looking forward to discuss it with the committee members, and I thus give back the word to Sir Rector Magnificus.